Alright, this is just an example from the last video because I didn't imprint any examples on that, but even from just looking at this flow chart, it gives you a pretty good understanding. I hope I explained it well enough and basically enough to where you kind of got an understanding. When you start getting into signal flow for different applications, that here's a good example that, it's real basic. I'm not going to get into why things are routed there and things like that, but just to understand when you're talking about signal flow of, where the signal is going. The signal is starting out here, the cord's going into what, and then it's going to where and to why. So that when you look at a setup like this, even this guy's guitar rig, that basically the signal flow of what's happening from coming out of the guitar all the way to the amplifiers and whatever monitoring systems they might be attached to, or mixing consoles, and the routing even going from there, taking it a step further. But basically that's just a basic picture that gives an example of signal flow. What's happening in the signal flow, where the signal is going. And, what you really need to work on is, with that basic understanding that is simple, is that why? Why would you want something to go somewhere else? Why would you want some processor to go off to somewhere else? Or, a send coming out of this and a return coming here, and, just simple concepts like that of why you would want to do that, so that you can track the signal of where it's going. So that, for the first thing, so that you know where the signal is going. And the second thing is so you can address issues. And the better you understand that, the better you're going to understand why you might want to do that. I mean, that's so that if you're sending a send off somewhere or a return off something, or, any multitudes of different configurations of, the signal flow and why that's happening and for what purpose, and, that specific way to run your signal flow and your effects chain or your processor chain, of why that would be and why you would want to do it that way. And I know that's a real basic outline, but that basically I wanted to throw out there. It was just a basic outline of that. So when somebody talks to you about the signal flow of a complex system, when you're dealing with audio engineering, that in the music or in the studio, that most times that's what they're talking about. And you can apply this to looking at a studio rig, a bunch of compressors and, whatever, all preamps and amplifiers and saturation, whatever all they might have in the studio, that, your signal flow, there it is. That's what they're talking about, and investigating why that is. And the best way to really get into that is really look at a studio and ask, what exactly, how is it set up, because how, you're running from what to what to what to what to what, and why, and, and how is it routing? And, if you look into it a little bit, you'll probably be very surprised how quick that you pick it up. You're probably going to have to understand a little bit about the actual audio engineering and what those processors do to understand why they're doing that. But the basic understanding of the signal flow for, a basic setup when you're dealing with those things, to understand why that's happening and where the signal is going, so that you've got a really good understanding of what to go to when you're having issues or have something done, and how you might want to reroute something forward to do something else. Does that make sense? And I know that's a real basic example, but that it's to address that issue, in its entirety, which I go pull up some things on studios for audio engineering, recording, mixing, and mastering, and do that also. But this is just a real basic example, so that when somebody talks to you about the signal flow, that's normally what they're looking at and what they're talking about. So I hope that example is real simple. The next thing you may be talking about is more complex systems. And when I'm talking about more complex systems of the signal flow, now, when we had talked about earlier about your electronics and all the electronic components, when you're doing actual audio engineering from that perspective, then you're dealing with the signal flow inside of the hardware, or this could be software code. Either way, that's the signal flow also, but a micro view of what's happening in there. And the better you understand this stuff, and the coding and what it's doing as it goes through there and how good the coding is can help you immensely. A real simple example is a plugin. You got this really cheesy, cheap, free plugin, and you've got this other plugin where this guy really did some good coding to really do some, very functional, processing, whereas this other coding for this cheap free plugin might be garbage, but it might emulate something along the lines of a compressor. Does that make sense? And that's another huge reason why. And I do suggest you get into that and really simply to look into it for your coding of your software and your hardware, to understand the signal flow and what it's going through, to get a little bit better understanding of what's happening. But that's just an example of those two situations, and just a real basic example, so that you can look at it and go, oh, that's not easy to understand why that is, and all the stuff that's combined with it, and why all those things are happening. I'm not explaining in this video, but that's just an example to clarify a little bit. So if you watched the last video and you went, well, what? It's like, that's what I'm talking about. And those two applications, and why you'd want to do, chart your signal flow and understand that. And I hope I explained that well enough in the first video of the reasons why you'd want to understand that, and the reasons why you'd want to have it mapped out and have a good understanding of what your signal flow is and the path of your signal. So I hope that was real basic understanding and a basic example, so that at least you're not confused by it when somebody says signal flow. You may not understand it until you read about it or research a little bit, depending on what signal flow that you're dealing with, for what type of a setup, for what specific instance and situation that you're trying to understand signal flow in. It can be specific and can be different in each situation. So I'm not addressing those at this point. So I hope that helped, and I hope you learned something, and I hope that was a good example to clarify that a little bit. And peace, hope, love. Have a nice day.